Hello there. Clam Blitz is a game mode that has a lot of potential to be really interesting. Since the objective is largely decentralized, that is, spread across different parts of the map and in the responsibility of all players, but scoring still requires map control under the basket in the enemy base. At the same time, the game mode's mechanics are so complicated that almost no one actually understands how to play this mode effectively. Most guides and information on Clam Blitz comes from Splatoon 2, where the mode worked a bit differently, so this video is aimed at being a resource for exactly how the mechanics work in Splatoon 3, and introduce some more advanced strategies about a good clam economy in the context of the current fast-paced meta. For this video, I will expect you to know the basics of the mode, that is, how scoring works and what the pity clam is. Clams spawn on the map in two ways, as so-called emit spawns at the start of the game, and as clam pods of 3 clams each throughout the match. 24 total emit clams will spawn at the start of the game, regardless of the map. Emit clam spawns are random, but the game will always spawn the same amount of clams in the same areas. I couldn't find a resource about where exactly the emit areas are in Splatoon 3, but from experience and a bit of experimentation, I noted down the general positions for all common and semi-common clam maps. You can find that resource in the description, but we'll talk about it a bit more later as well. Clam pod spawning has a bit more depth, since it happens throughout the whole game. On each map there are a select amount of clam pod spawn locations. They are mirrored on both teams' sides of the map. When spawning clams, the game will select a random spawn location that is not occupied. A clam pod spawn location is occupied if there is a player or clam on its spawn point. That means you can lock clam pods forever by taking 2 clams and leaving 1 behind. Normal clams and power clams thrown by players despawn after 10 seconds, but clams spawned by the game don't, so the pod remains locked until someone picks up the last clam. If a clam pod is spawned successfully, the game will remember the pod and try to spawn clams at the mirrored location on the other team's side the next spawning attempt. If that pod happens to be occupied, the game will select a random unoccupied spawn like usual. The game tries to spawn clam pods every 12 seconds, until there are 40 active clams on the map. Active clams include clams held by players and clams on the ground, but do not include power clams at all. That means that 1. The pity clam doesn't have any influence on clam spawning, neither when on the ground nor when picked up, and 2. That when you make a power clam from normal clams, the amount of active clams instantly drops by 8. The game can also enter an accelerated spawn state if the amount of active clams on the map is less than 20, or the game enters an overtime where neither team has scored. In the accelerated spawn state, the game will try to spawn clam pods every 4 seconds instead of every 12, 3 times as fast. That is really strong when scoring in a longer lasting push. 2 more things. In Clam Blitz you will get passive special charge of 3 points per second if you are losing, aka you have scored less points, or you have at least 1 power clam picked up and the enemy doesn't. This can override the previous effect, so if you are winning and have at least 1 PC, but the enemy doesn't, you get 3 P per second and they don't, even though they are losing. If you are losing, picking up a PC doesn't change anything if the enemy team isn't holding one. If both teams hold a PC, the losing team gets 3 points per second. Also, when getting splatted, you can only drop a maximum of 3 clams, though it isn't just a cutoff at 3, the curve is a bit slower. Okay. With the fundamentals out of the way, it's time to talk about how to play this mode effectively. To score in Clam Blitz you need 2 things. The map control to score clams, and the actual clams themselves. The biggest mistake I see when reviewing low-level Clam Blitz is that teams don't care about clams enough, and just play a team deathmatch. As stupid as it sounds to say out loud, the most important thing in Clam Blitz are the clams. Splatoon 3 is a really fast game. You can gain map control of the basket really fast, but you can also lose it just as fast. Fully capitalizing on the window where you can score is really important. Because of that, a big focus in neutral should be to prepare for the push, so that when it happens we can score as much as possible. That means to use some of your time in neutral to collect clams, preferably during downtime like recovering your ink tank. As antithetical as it sounds to waste time in this game where speed is so important, this is a preparation to be able to play fast when it really matters. You don't want to waste time under the enemy basket trying to make a power clam. In specific, every player should aim to have around 3 to 5 clams in neutral, so that you can make a power clam as fast as possible. Having clams distributed between all players will enable us to fight more without being worried about losing too many clams when one player goes down. Weapons that play more aggressively should be on the lower side on the clam count, since you don't want to waste all your clams by getting splatted. Since supportive or backline players usually play a bit more safely, they should aim to have a few more to be able to make a power clam quickly when the opportunity to score arises. Generally, I'd say to avoid making power clams before having control of the enemy basket, since the location effect will make it hard to push. The exception here is pencil, since that weapon doesn't really care much if it's located or not. In addition, as previously discussed, making a PC will reduce the active clam count by 8, so it can sometimes be worth it making one in order to have more clam spawns on the map. It also sometimes gives you passive special charge, but that usually doesn't mean too much. In Splatoon, the opening is the most important time of the game, and in Clam Blitz it's really important to gather the emit spawns. I've compiled emit spawns and routes I'd recommend taking on all Clam Blitz I've seen played competitively into a resource that you can access from the first link in the description. The routes that are a larger detour and involve picking up more clams should usually be taken by more supportive or backline weapons. Picking up emits on opening has 3 reasons. First, you always want to have a good amount of clams picked up as a team, and picking up emits on your way towards mid doesn't do any harm except taking slightly longer. You should be painting and taking different paths on your way towards mid anyways, so picking up emits usually isn't even a detour. Second, if you leave emits in your base, they can be used by the enemy when pushing. Those clams are usually really close to your basket, so it's really convenient for the enemy to get a few more points in. Thirdly and lastly, picking up emits will mean clam pods spawn faster and more consistently, which is useful when pushing. Speaking of which, in Clam Blitz it's really important to have pushes that score a lot of points. Since the enemy team gets a power clam that doesn't despawn each time their basket closes, pushes where you score almost nothing or only chip away at your penalty are heavily punished by the game. Tacticular encourages a lot of fight taking, and that can make it difficult to both get the necessary map control and to keep enough clams to get a good score in. All that leads to the 2 main ways competitive teams will push in Clam Blitz. First, the clam dump strat. This revolves around getting a decent amount of clams, usually in the form of power clams, and dumping them all into the basket as quickly as possible. The upside of this is that you only need map control of the basket area for a very brief amount of time, just enough to dump all the clams in or get a super jump spot in. However, it is risky and takes a bit of time to set up. You need to make 2+ power clams first, which will reveal the carrier's location and force you into a relatively slow playstyle. You will need to brute force a lot of your entries. That means having lots of specials that can get you a short but large power spike of advantage. The other downside is that it usually results in the majority of your team getting splatted immediately after scoring. This isn't a huge issue if the team is coolered, but it will still lose you a lot of map control. The enemy team may also be able to get in a counter push, since they'll have specials and a lot of clams, because dumping so many clams usually leads to the accelerated spawn state to trigger. The second, and in my opinion more optimal way to score, is playing for a strong clam economy and a longer hold of map control under the enemy basket. The idea is to gradually move forward with relatively safe fights, and then set up to hold the enemy basket area for as long as possible, while one teammate gathers clams. This is a lot safer and can lead to crazy amount of scored points if played correctly, since scoring so much can sometimes trigger the accelerated spawn state. However, this type of push requires you to hold basket control for a while, and it does take a lot of setup. Specifically, it requires what I call a good clam economy. Most people use the term clam economy very loosely, but I think giving it the more specific meaning of being able to get many clams fast when scoring is better. One important step of a good clam economy is to lock clam pods in your base. Locking is the previously mentioned strategy of picking up 2 clams and leaving 1 there to stop the game from spawning clams in that position. Locking clam pods on your side of the map will mean that clams will always spawn in mid or on the enemy side. This takes some time to set up, but it is crucial for this type of push, since you rely on clam spawns that are close to the basket to be able to keep it open. The most important spots are in your base, where you practically can't get to when pushing, but you can also lock pods that are closer to mid if you have good map control. Clam locking was done more diligently in Splatoon 2 than it is now, because you could pick up 3/4 of the clam pod, and PCs requiring 10 clams, as well as the game being played slower, meant that a strong clam economy was more important than it is now. I want to acknowledge that the consensus at high and top level play is that locking clams is usually not worth it in Splatoon 3 and the current fast-paced meta. From my understanding, this is mostly due to the threat of a more prolonged push being very difficult to achieve when players play defense more optimally, which means locking clam pods is a bit of a waste of time and clams. Nevertheless, from my experience as a coach for low level and as a mid-level player, mid-level with an asterisk, I believe that, at least in those skill environments, locking clams will get a lot of value, and I'd encourage you to try it out for yourself, even if it be to decide against doing it. We can see a good example of this kind of push in this replay generously provided by Bold. The first thing that happens in this situation is that Alpha team, the orange team here, wins the mid fight while using very few specials. This puts us in a good situation to be able to push forward and get control of the enemy basket and then use all our specials under the enemy basket. We can see here we are pretty much at all our specials. Cooler may take a little longer, but we pretty much have all our specials. We have a decent amount of clams, enough to get the score started. We don't have super many, but we have enough that we can open the basket and then get a few clams in and then start bringing clams in that spawn somewhere close to the basket. What we see here is that this push first of all works on the basis of map control, because we have so many specials, and that means that we can win this fight relatively safely. We trade out a bit, but we still have so many specials and such a good position that we are able to keep up control and get a wipeout in the end. What we see now is that this score will get a lot of points and in the end knock out the game, simply because accelerated spawn state triggers. We've scored enough clams that the active amount of clams has dropped a lot, and that means that clams will start spawning very fast now. One thing that the team could have done a little better in this situation is that there are a lot of unlocked clams in their base right now, which will be pretty much impossible to collect in this situation. And this brings up the amount of active clams a bit, which actually means that during some parts of this push, we don't have accelerated clam spawning. It's fine, because we have such good map control that we'll still knock out the game, but it could have been better if, in this situation, the base clams were locked. Then clams would have spawned at ridiculously speeds directly next to the basket, and we could have knocked out a lot faster and with a bit less trouble at the end. And we can see the clams spawning very fast right now. I think this is the point where accelerated spawning stops, and this is where it will get a bit closer. But what this team does very well is that they stall their clam scoring, which means that we can keep up the basket for a longer amount of time. You see Jenny on the dynamo here doesn't score yet. We wait for the cooldown to get a bit lower so that like the basket stays open for the longest amount of time we can, to give our teammates enough time to bring back the clams in. And this situation is a bit scary, but we only need 2 more points, so we can pretty much go for a suicide score here, which is pretty much what happens, I think. Yep. Very good example of how strong clam scores can be. We went from 62 to knockout in the span of like 30 seconds, just because we had a very good hold under the enemy basket and we were able to get clams in due to accelerated clam spawning. We can see a few good examples of the clam dump strat in this replay provided by my former teammate and goated Rabbit Pro player Evelyn. We can see how the enemy team in this situation approaches with a few power clams and just scores all the clams that they possibly can, but in exchange wipe afterwards. Here we can see the downside of the strat as well. Because we wipe, we lose all kinds of map control, and because of accelerated clam spawning, we see that the blue team can get a lot of clams here, in addition to having a lot of specials. That means we are set up quite well for a counter push, and this is exactly what happens in this situation. We have a lot of clams in this situation, 3 power clams, and we are able to get all of them in this situation. This again is the same strat of dumping as many clams in as you can. This gets them lead and a very good score, but at the same time a few of us go down afterwards. The rest of the team plays this very well and backs up here, but it still gives the enemy team a good opportunity to counter push, and we can see that while this is very close, they are still able to get a counter push in the end. On defense, the most important thing is to get control of the basket back, or to control the paths enemies want to take towards the basket to bring clams in. As with all modes, it is crucial to avoid staggering and taking individual fights. Wait for your team, get specials, and then you should be able to get basket control back, since the enemy needs 1 player to get clams. Scoring usually doesn't last very long in Clam Blitz, but stalling to stop enemies from scoring will take up a big amount of time in a match. In defense situations like this, it can be a good idea to collect a lot of clams yourself. That would mean that there are a lot of active clams overall, so few clams will spawn and enemies will have a rough time getting enough clams for a good push. Absolutely do not make a power clam though. That would decrease the amount of active clams, leading to more spawns, in addition to you being located. The pity clam will never despawn unless you decide to pick it up. Because of that, it should be used as the threat of getting 20 points quickly from a jump in. That can both work in the dump strat and the slow clam economy based push. For the second one, it would be the responsibility of the person that goes down first after the basket is opened to jump in the pity clam on respawn. I don't think the pity should be picked up much outside of that context. The negative effects of being located are not worth sometimes getting special advantage, and are especially not worth it to give up the threat of 20 extra points scored on your next push. There are actually a few resources you can use to stop people jumping in with super clams from scoring it. The easiest and most useful one is to spam dry strikes on the landing point. The DPS will be fast enough to splat enemies before they can score. This is a lot harder to time, but you can also stop jump-ins with bombs. It will have to explode right as they land though. Another strat is to use Splash Wall right where the enemy lands. It's far from consistent, but it can push people away just enough to mess up their aim on the throw. Overtime in Clam Blitz triggers when the losing team has a power clam or has the enemy basket opened. It will also trigger when the losing team's basket is open, but the team was winning before the basket opened. Overtime lasts for 20 seconds, or until the losing team has 0 power clams, aka the existing power clam despawns, the winning team scores, the losing team scores enough to win, or the losing team scores but the basket closes before getting lead. Generally, 20 seconds is really not a lot of time, so you'll have to get something done fast. Clam Blitz is in a bit of a weird spot competitively, since cooler the map design and basket placement partially go against the mode's identity. A big part, however, is also just that a lot of people don't know the mode's mechanics and strategies. which I hope to have combated with this video. I'd also like to thank those who have directly or indirectly helped me with making this video. In specific, Bobella, Jin, Eflem, Bold, Anon and Mr. Egg for helping me test some data around clam spawning mechanics, helping me record some clips and providing me with competitive clams footage. Oatmeal Dome for data mining and making an article about clam spawning in Splatoon 2, which is where much of the terminology used in this video comes from. As well as Pika for making a video about Splatoon 2 clam mechanics and strategies. The socials of all these amazing people are in the description of this video, go check them out. Also tournament organizers, please add Meko Mud clams into map lists. No one would actually care about having 3 mods per map and Meko is the best clams map in the game by far, please. Also highly appreciate the work you do for the community, okay bye!